Alright, welcome back, guys. Today we're going to talk about the American Revolution. So if we think about it, back in the mid to late 18th century, there were several European nations that struggled to keep a presence in the New World. There should be three. You can name those. What are they? Alright, think of them in your head. Write them down. I'm going to ask you that. The 13 colonies, they were prosperous out of those three. They founded for reasons including economic, political, religious freedom, and the colonies grew in both population and wealth. It was a great time for the 13 colonies. However, conflicts between England and France led to the French and Indian War in North America, and England won control of a huge empire it couldn't effectively govern, and it had run up a massive war debt, so it owed lots of money. England began to press the colonies for revenue through taxation, and they also imposed a lot of restrictive laws on them to limit who they could sell to and what they could sell. The colonists, in return, resisted these, citing that they had a right for no taxation without representation in the British Parliament, and that itself began to lead to other issues. So, as the British continued to assert their authority, protests and eventually war broke out. This is going to detail those, and I want you to take very close notes. The first thing we're going to talk about here is some of the questions you need to answer. Like, why did England increase colonial taxation? Why did England move away from the policy of salutary neglect? Which colonial leaders stood out as the most vocal and most radical? Go and read through these. You can pause the video if you need to and write some down. But these are questions you need to answer as you're listening to me talk. Let's talk about England and the colonies. So England's victory in the French and Indian War made it a superpower in both Europe and North America. In 1763, the Treaty of Paris ended the war and gave England most of France's territory in the New World, nearly doubling the amount of land that the British had held there. However, the cost of winning the war was huge. The British Prime Minister, William Pitt, very important name, you need to write that down, had spent millions to defeat the French and had run up a massive war debt. In addition, the British Army now had thousands of miles to defend, and it didn't have the resources or men to defend all of these areas. If you look right here on the map, you'll notice the green part. Imagine defending that whole area from Native Americans and possibly from the French again. It was a major issue. The British military and treasury were stretched extremely thin, so to compensate, the British looked to its colonial empire, the colonists, the 13, to pay the cost of the war, largely through taxes and legislations regarding the colonial economies, mercantilism. To the British, it made sense that since the colonists had benefited from the British protection, they should also help cover the cost of that protection. We talked about this in class. Even though they were part of the 13 colonies and they were part of the British Empire, they were made to feel like it was their responsibility for paying for the safety of themselves rather than the safety of the British Empire in a whole. So the colonists, their view was a little bit different. Not only were the taxes too high, but they felt like the taxes were unfair, and so they began to take up arms. Talk about some of the rebellions. Pontiac's Rebellion and the Proclamation of 1763. These are very important. A confederation of Native Americans led by Ottawa Indian chief Pontiac began a rebellion against the British in territories England had just gained from France in the Treaty of Paris. Now remember, the Native Americans were trading with the French quite happily and living almost symbiotically. But then the British come in, and the British are not as symbiotic with the Native Americans. The rebellion included attacks on several British forts, many outposts. It included Fort Detroit and Fort Pitt. However, Pontiac could not hold various tribes together, and the British forces eventually crushed the rebellion. But as a result of this near disaster, the British government realized the difficulty of protecting settlers and British interest in the newly acquired areas. So they owned the area, but they didn't want to fight the Native Americans in that area. So, in an effort to protect it, King George III signed what's become known now as the Proclamation of 1763, which temporarily restricted settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. That's very important. Write down Proclamation of 1763, restricted settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. Both settlers and land speculators were looking to find cheap and large tracts of land. However, they believed this proclamation prevented them from doing that. It restricted them unfairly. So in addition, they weren't they weren't happy with the British for some of the reservations on land they had, but also the veterans of the French and Indian War, they were not ordinary settlers. They had already fought these wars, and they felt like they deserved this land. They had won this land. We've got to think about the people that fought in the French and Indian War. Many of them were colonial settlers. They were people who were part of the regiment there. In fact, one of the main soldiers from that time was a man named George Washington, who we're going to talk a little more about. Pretty important guy when it comes to American history. This is salutary neglect. One factor which led and tended to cause friction between the colonies and England was its moving away from the policies of salutary neglect. Under this policy, the British they didn't bother to enforce many of the laws affecting colonial trade. The logic was if England didn't restrict colonial trade, the colonies' economies would grow and benefit from both them and the mother country. The British government generally left the colonies alone to make their own decisions, allowing them a fair amount of self-government and control over their own matters. But as we found out, once they started controlling themselves, it changed their attitudes. However, with the coming of the French and Indian War and the subsequent increase of British debt, England had to rethink its policies. Faced with this huge debt, the British needed stricter enforcement of the laws. So many of these laws were already in place, they were just avoided here and there. So in order to collect the revenue, they needed to really clamp down on the colonists and make them follow this. The colonists, in turn, they became angered, particularly since they had become accustomed to not having to follow these laws, but because they also were self-ruled. So they went from not following the laws to making their own decisions, and now being backed down out of those decisions. I want you to take a second, pause it, and read over these discussion questions and try to answer them as we continue on. Navigation Acts and Molasses Act. Now, I know it may sound funny to you, but huge parts of the American Revolution can be taken back to this one point, the Molasses Act. So the Navigation Acts were a series of laws instituted in 1651. They were designed to protect both the British and the colonial shipping industries by requiring that goods headed for colonies or to the mother country could only be shipped on British or colonial ships manned by British or colonial crews. So that prevented some crews who were not friendly to the colonies from destroying or losing their goods or selling them somewhere else. So in the early 18th century, more laws were added that further restricted shipping and also prevented certain goods from being shipped outside of the colonies. So now you see that they're being told where they can sell their items to or who can ship it for them. And the Molasses Act, this one was really important. Passed by Parliament in 1733, especially angered the colonists, made them really mad because the law placed a really high tax on molasses, which was imported from the French West Indies. As a result, the colonists had to buy high-priced molasses from the British West Indies. The colonial merchants tended to lose money because the French molasses was no longer available at the cheaper price, and as a result, the colonial merchants frequently attempted to bypass the law by smuggling French molasses without paying for the tax. Now you may think, why is it such a big deal to smuggle molasses? Well, there's two things. One is, food is usually rather bland. If you don't have salt, pepper, spices, if you want to add something sweet to it, molasses can be added. But another major thing is molasses is also used to make rum. And we know where that goes. The British and the 13 colonies, and even America once it's formed, we see all kinds of fights back and forth about alcohol, even to the Prohibition movement to eliminate alcohol completely from the United States. And we also saw how that backfired. So the same thing happens. They were limiting the amount of alcohol that they could make for rum out of molasses, as well as cooking with molasses, making everything from pancakes and covering it with molasses to enjoying it on your breads. So this is a major issue, the colonists being happy. I want you to think about that. Think about major issues, taxing tea, what they enjoyed drinking. They didn't have Brita filters or water filters at this time. You couldn't go and pick up bottled water from the store. You had to get it out of a stream. You might be able to boil it. You might be able to filter it some, but it still tasted nasty. So adding tea was a way of enjoying your water. And then same thing with molasses. Some of the food was strong. Adding molasses gave it a sweet taste and you could enjoy it. The Sugar Act. Once again, notice the trend here. This is sugar. Tea, sugar, molasses, coffee, indigo, and wine. These are all coupled or placed into the same category. One early British attempt to get more revenue from the colonies was this Sugar Act. Passed by Parliament in 1764, the law taxed sugar, coffee, indigo, which remember, indigo is a dye used from plants. It's produced, so enjoying colors of clothing, and wine. In addition, those who tried to avoid paying these taxes were tried by British military courts rather than colonial courts because the latter were more likely to involve judges and juries sympathetic to the violators of the acts. So they didn't want, if you were selling sugar to someone and you didn't pay taxes on it, you didn't go to a normal court. You had to go to a military trial from the British because they knew that the colonists felt bad for you. So the Sugar Act was effective and had a collection of taxes on these goods, which increased more than 150% in the years after the French and Indian War. Write that number down. 150% increase. Now imagine if you have something that costs $10 and you have a 10% tax on it, you're going to pay $1. Now, rather than a 10% tax, you have a 150% increase on the taxes. So it wasn't just a little tax, it was a lot of taxes being increased and added over what they were used to paying. So the British Prime Minister, George Grenville, his aim with the Sugar Act was to have the colonists pay off more of the war debt while ending smuggling of goods to avoid taxation. While the Sugar Act gained a large amount of support in England, the people in England liked it, it met with significant opposition from the colonists, who felt they should not be taxed without having representation in Parliament. Representation, no taxation without representation. That should stick in your mind for the rest of your life. Now we have the Stamp Act. This Stamp Act is just another way. The British were going every single thing they could to come up with, how can we get money out of these people? Let's charge them for this. Let's charge them for that. What do they eat? What do they do? Now let's add a tax to almost everything else that they have. In opposition to the British taxation and control, it reached a point in 1765 with Parliament's passage of the Stamp Act. They had finally had enough. It was designed to raise the revenue for the defense and protection of the colonies. This was specifically for protecting this new land. Parliament hoped that the Stamp Act would bring nearly 60,000 British pounds. However, hardly any of the money ended up being collected at all. The Stamp Act essentially taxed all printed material in the colonies, including deeds, licenses, newspapers, printed documents, even playing cards. An embossed stamp put on the paper showed that the tax had been paid. So if you went to somewhere and you got a newspaper and you didn't see this stamp on there, then it was not being taxed properly and you could get in trouble for owning it. Not just for selling it, but for owning it. A major downside of the Stamp Act was it was a direct tax. This is tax added to the price of the item being purchased. Every time the colonists saw the stamp, it reminded them personally that they were being taxed without representation in Parliament. This angered the colonists further, and resistance. These included protest, tarring and feathering of the tax collectors, and organizing groups to oppose the Stamp Act. These all became common. So if you want to take a moment, look up tarring and feathering and teaing. Teaing, they would, this is in opposition to the taxes on teas that came a little bit later. They would take hot tea and pour it down the throat of the tax collectors. Now, we feel bad for the tax collectors. Okay, they weren't bad guys. They were here to collect the taxes. But they were often poured with hot tar and then added feathers to them, so they ran around looking like giant chickens while their skin was getting hurt, boiled, burned. Not a pleasant thing to do, but it definitely got their point across. This should be enough for today. I hope that you've learned some from this, and all of this will fit nicely into the document that you're working on. Please remember that I want to see each of you working your hardest to take these and then write them out in your notebooks.